facial reconstruction of Richard. I'm sure most of you have seen that. Some recent information about his, I suppose it was the autosomal DNA, shows that he probably had blue eyes and a light brown hair, like that's shown here. On the right there's his signature. Richard, he was the Duke of Gloucester. It says Richard Gloucester. And he carried a motto with his signature, which is French, which means loyalty binds me. And when I first got into this, so I didn't understand, they published this DNA type haplogroup, and I didn't really notice that in the news. I was following the find quite closely, but when I got my results from just a 23andMe basic test, it came back J1C2C, and I did a Google, and all this stuff came up about Richard III. And but these were partial DNA tests, so I was kind of like, well, I don't understand this DNA enough to really feel that comfortable about it. But I went ahead and set up a web page looking for other people that had this, and one of the things browsing around, I found this Richard III Society, and these guys are just really into this stuff. They're Ricardians, they call themselves. Here's one of their publications. They put these out about 4 times a year. It's really good stuff. You can see it's very professionally done. And but it's looks like they're mostly historians, and man, they really get into this stuff, digging into the history. And when you read it, you start to realize the real character of Richard starts showing through this, and doesn't really go along with what you were raised to believe. I guess I didn't have an opinion either way, but I thought, well, back in that period of time, everybody was pretty rough and bad. But what you see in Richard was, I don't think he ever really expected to be king. He was the 3rd son. His older brothers had sons. That wasn't a part of it. He was actually groomed to work with the church. He had a religious education, and it said that he became very religious. He was a very prayerful man. And certainly the loyalty, you can see that with his brother, King Edward IV. From the age of 18, he was fighting beside Edward.
What year was this?
The reconstruction, facial? Richard died in 1485.
Richard III?
Richard III, yeah.
Died.
So that's over 400 or 500 years ago.
He didn't reign long, right?
No, he didn't. Only really 2.5 years, I think. But his brother, he was always there. And of course, this is back in a time when these kings, they didn't sit on the sidelines watching battles, right? They were right in the front fighting, and Richard was next to him. And this went on. This was the War of the Roses. This was the main part of it. And Edward had to. He ended up having a long reign. There was a little interruption there in the middle of it. But when you became king back then, you pretty much accepted the fact that you were going to be overthrown one day, and if you weren't killed in battle, you would be put to death, right? So here's a quote from the current Duke of Gloucester. The purpose and indeed the strength of the Richard III Society derives from the belief that the truth is more powerful than lies, a faith that even after all these centuries, the truth is important. And the lies they talk about are, here's some of them. And the society for 93 years has been trying to correct this. One of them, of course, the hunchback, we now know that from the recent find. He didn't have a hunchback. He had scoliosis, but it didn't cause a hunchback. This was a Shakespeare thing. So after Richard was killed, Henry Tudor became king. Henry VII, he would have been. And they started a campaign of really slander. They took Richard. They wanted to make sure that you had with the War of the Roses, you had this group from Yorks and then the Lancasters that were fighting, and the Yorks were, which was what Richard was, and they wanted to. I think Tudor really wanted to make sure this War of the Roses came to an end, and this was the way he went about it, was to really make Richard look like an evil, really bad person. And I'm sure there were a lot of people in fear that didn't want to go against that. But the historical documentation, there are pieces that suggest that Richard was very well liked within the kingdom. That he killed Henry VI's son. Well, Edward, well, he was killed in battle. Richard didn't have anything to do with that. Henry VI, well, that was what his brother Edward IV overthrew him. And you know, that was standard procedure. When you overthrew somebody, you put them to death. You got rid of them. And his brother, the Duke of Clarence, which was named George, George tried to overthrow his own brother Edward. They let him back in the family, and he tried to do it again and failed. In which case, Edward put him to death at that time. There's no documentation that Richard was involved in that, and he shouldn't have been because he wasn't the king. And then, of course, the princes in the Tower. This is brought up a lot, and really, I think you just got to look at who had the motive here. And there is one piece of evidence too that a lot of people don't realize. But so let's consider what happened. Edward IV, he got sick unexpectedly, and he called Richard in, who was his most loyal servant, really, and he made him promise to be the protector of his heir, which would become Edward V. When he died, Edward V, who was 12 years old, became the king. Now, a lot of people in the kingdom didn't like that. You know, this is the War of the Roses, and we got a 12-year-old king now. And there's no indication Richard was involved in this, but they pulled out something they had known for a while, and that was that King Edward IV never terminated his first marriage, and all his children were in the second marriage. So they said, these kids are they're not eligible. They're illegitimate. And but there was a delay in this. King Edward V ended up being king for about 85 days before this happened. And you've got Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor had a claim to the throne, but he had to get rid of this new king. And now he had a brother too. So Richard did his part. He, as the protector, he carried the new king to the Tower in London, and which was not just a place for prisoners, it was also a place to protect people. So he brought him there and left him there. He was safe, and then this decision was made where Richard was made king because these boys were not eligible. So all of a sudden Richard became king, but Tudor may have already had things in motion, and these boys disappeared. And according to historical documentation, nobody really knew what happened to them. So Richard, though, when Tudor takes over, he says, well, it was Richard that killed him. Now, the one thing that people don't realize is that, so after the battle, Tudor defeats Richard III, that made him the king. Richard had an heir. That doesn't count when you've been defeated in battle, but he had an heir. And guess what? And the heir was the son of Richard's brother, who had been executed. And Tudor went out, rounded him up, arrested him, and executed him. So, now you see the pattern. He's gotten rid of everybody, right? And he becomes king. And Richard's wife, this is another thing, and I think Shakespeare went off on this too, that Richard poisoned his wife. Anne got sick shortly after Richard became king, and about a year later they lost their only son. He was about 14 years old, I think. And she went downhill rapidly after that. No historical documentation that anybody tried to kill her. She died of natural causes. And interesting things, speaking about the total solar eclipse, it's documented that when Anne died, the sun disappeared. Now, Tudor later on said that was because God was unhappy with Richard for killing his wife, right? Yeah, right. Well, NASA decided to take the challenge of, well, there's only one way the sun can disappear. And they went back and did calculations, and it was a little bit complicated because the Earth has a wobble, so going back and finding these dates and locations is a little tricky, but they did it, and guess what? It was a total solar eclipse cutting right through London, which is where Anne died on that day. Yeah. So the Richard, The Third Society was started in 1924, so it's been around for some time. But in the last few years, they did something. They were behind something that's probably really turning the tables. Odessa and I, about the time Richard was discovered, there had already been a book written called The White Queen, and they turned it into a mini-series in England. And you can see watching that when you get done at the end, it's the War of the Roses. The White Queen is actually Edward IV's wife. It's mostly centered around her, but it covers all the way through until Richard is killed. And you come away from it with the feeling that Richard was, of all the people in this, he was maybe the best character of all of them. So there's already, you can see this trend of things are changing. You know, the society is bringing the truth out in a lot of this. And then the big thing that they've done here recently is they took on the effort to locate Richard. Felipe Langley was the woman that within the society that took this over. She's not an archaeologist, she's not a historian, but they had some information on that. You know, Richard it was one of two things. His body was thrown in a river, in which case you could never find it, or he was buried in a church, which was burned 50 years after Richard died by none other than King Henry VIII, who was Tudor's son. And is that a surprise, right, that would be his son? So they had some information. They went. It was in Leicester, and they had the area, and there was a little parking lot there that would be a good place to try. So they brought in an archaeologist from the University of Leicester, and I think the archaeologist, based on comments he made, I don't think he had any hope at all that they would find Richard. He wanted to find the church, and they came out. They came out to the little parking lot to do a trench, similar to like what we did at Fort Congaree too.
Why did they know it was parking lot? Why did they know that the parking lot was the location?
Well, there weren't very many places they could dig easily. That was it's pretty dense around the area.
But did they know the church?
They knew the church was taking up that area, and they wanted to capture one of the the foundation or the wall of the church, and so they were using the technique like we used at Fort Congaree too, to do a trench and just cut across until you hit something, one of the foundations. And when they got there, they noticed this faint R that was painted on the parking lot.
Question.
But they decided, the archaeologist said, well, what the heck, we'll just start the trench here. And right under that R, they found this.
So how did you explain that one?
Yeah. Well, the archaeologist on TV, he said, these were his words. He says, in archaeology, you don't ever go out looking for a famous person and find him. It just doesn't happen. And he said this after it happened, right? So in other words, he's pretty much, scientists don't like to say miracle, but he's pretty much saying this was a miracle. It's like,
who painted the R? Yeah, that's
nobody knows. And it was pretty faded, like it hadn't been done recently, right? So what they found, of course, they didn't know for sure this was Richard, but the scoliosis, I think I've read somewhere that's like 70 or 80 degrees. It's pretty bad. I don't know if any of you saw on TV a couple of years ago, they found a man in England that had the same degree of scoliosis. And they trained it. They wondered, how could Richard be such a good fighter? And they trained this guy, and on a horse, he could actually do it. Now, you knock him off the horse, he couldn't do anything, which is what happened to Richard in the battle. He was knocked off his horse and killed.
How old was he?
Kingdom for all.
How old was he when he died?
He would have been 32 or 33. He wasn't very old. And he had there was a fatal wound to the skull, which they later said was consistent with like a battle injury. And then they did carbon dating, and it came back 15th century. So that looked really good, but that was not enough evidence in itself. You're making a big claim here that this was a king. So that's where we come back into John Austin Hill, who had done that original genealogy work. So here's Michael Ebsen. This is the guy you saw in the beginning here. Later on, we think it was later on, they also did Wendy Doldig, who's from New Zealand. They found her. and they did these partial maternal DNA tests. Came back this J1C2C, which is if you were to pick somebody on the street, there'd be a 1 in 16,000 chance. There's about 500,000 people in the world that have it, so it's relatively small. But the group is kind of spread out over Europe. It's not, you see people from Russia. This haplogroup may have been around for at least 2,000 years, probably. Now, if you notice down here, this was something interesting. Anne, the niece of Richard III, is Anne St. Ledger, and she was married to a George Manners. Well, going back about 20 years, this is a picture Odessa took. We took my mom to England. My mom knew her ancestry was English, but that was about it. And we took her here. This is Windsor Castle, and we went into St. George Chapel where we saw Anne St. Ledger and George Manners' tomb, which of course at the time we didn't know who these people were, and it's not in our wildest dreams did we think there could be some kind of a relation to them. But the really funny thing is George Manners is in a line, paternal line of men who have the title of the Marquis of Granby. And about 4 generations down, I think it is, there was a George Manners. Now, most of these guys, it's just a title, they don't really do anything. But about 4 generations down, there was a John Manners he went off in this battle against the English, against the French, and he did all these heroic things. And he was just like the biggest hero in England. And in the colonies, a bunch of places named their towns after him. And one of them is in Connecticut, Granby, Connecticut. I think Missouri has one. And of course, we had one here in Casey. But there's still more. So at this point with the DNA, most people were satisfied. They said, yeah, it sounds good. Some people still seemed a little skeptical, like me about the DNA. What does that really mean, this J1C2C group? It's like, is that really good enough here? Nobody would challenge it, but they went along with it. But then more things started coming in. The bones, your bones, different bones hold information about your diet. Some hold them from when you're young, and then others hold it for just the last few years of your life. And what they found in these bones is that the person was eating like he was in a royal family early in life, and then the last 3 years there was a dramatic improvement over that. He was eating a lot of fish, peacock, which was a delicacy, they can detect this stuff, and wine, a bottle of wine every day. These things were really hard to get to, so this really said that this guy was eating like a king. Yeah, a bottle of wine a day.
Dave, where did they extract his DNA from?
Do you remember, no shoe, where I think they, for the bones, for living people, it's easy. You just get it from your saliva. But for like that, for those bones, shoe right off which bones hold the dietary.
When they're looking to see relationships, they use the molars, the teeth. The teeth are probably the best one.
Yeah, I believe, and that does sound like that. I think I do remember now that may have been what they were using, and it took a long time. So I'm getting to this now, the full sequence mitochondrial test. That took like 9 months on Richard. And I had set up this website, and a researcher, Dr. Ian Logan, in England, who's was really following this, really into it. In fact, he had done a lot of work recording and creating new haplogroups of people that go into this gen bank, which is which scientists use to record unique DNA sets. And he saw the webpage and he contacted me and he said, you should really do the full sequence. They're starting it on the king right now. So I went ahead and did that. It only took 2 months to come back for me. And there was an additional mutation. Well, I thought then, I said, well, the king, they only did 2,500 markers on him. Maybe he probably doesn't have that, and maybe he's got additional things that I don't have. But after 9 months, 7 or 9 months, the results came in on the king, and Dr. Logan called me and said, well, congratulations, it's an exact match. And I still, I'm still like, well, what does that mean? And I went up to the gen bank and I downloaded Richard III's mitochondrial DNA file. I downloaded mine and I did a binary compare of the two files, and they were identical. So that's all 16,500.
So what does that mean?
So it means that you have mutations. In that paper I sent out yesterday, Dr. Logan goes into great details, these haplogroups. And actually I've got a slide coming up that we can speak to that on. But the bottom line is now, the 3 years we've been searching for people, we're up to about 20 people now that have been tested, and over half of those are actually in our close family. Like I found a 5th cousin through genealogy, contacted him, had him do the test. Sure enough, he was in the maternal line, he had it. So we found a lot of people like that, just randomly though, letting people come into the database. There's very few, and so Dr. Logan has concluded that this is a extremely rare haplogroup, and it's more like now a 1 in 10 billion chance. So this really adds to the original case that these really are the bones of Richard, now that we consider this, because Michael Epson and Wendy Dolbig, they also had the full sequence test. Michael's identical to me. Wendy has an additional mutation that's happened in the last 300 years. So when you get your results, they show you something like this. These are all the differences. Let me see if I can focus this better. So what they did way back in the early days of DNA, they had these guys that were working on it, and they thought, what we really need to do is to have a reference, the Cambridge reference standard. So I've been referring to mutations and all, but these are just markers that are different. Now, so these are the ones right here. I mean, you got 16,000 some markers, but these are the only things that are different. And a couple of these together mean you're in the J group. Another one means you're in the J1. Another one added to that, the J1C2, and so forth. So really, for the most part, we all have the same mitochondrial DNA. There's just some differences. And you don't want a lot, it's risky when the mutations do pop up. They could have negative effects. This could kill you. If you get something bad, you may not live long, right? So this is kind of what it looks like. This test was done through Family Tree DNA. It's like about, I think, $200 for a full sequence. You can't beat that, and they're really good at it. Now early on, I kind of had a theory about the haplogroup. It really didn't work out that well with the J1C2C, but with this additional mutation, this really fits well. So here's the population of the world, and there's only really one place where it decreases, and this was around the year, maybe 1200 and 1500, right in that range. So there's some diseases and stuff going around. Population decreases. But if you look at the Plantagenet family, the women were having like 6 to 12 children each. And most of them, because of the good diet, good conditions, they were living to also do this. So you have a huge population explosion in the Plantagenet family in England. And what that can tell us here is that, well, maybe that coupled with the fact that every J1C2C3 we have found, the maternal lines go straight to England. That other group, the J1C2C, we have, there's people in Russia, they're all over here, but this group, they're all in England, which kind of adds to this that, yeah, maybe this did happen. Maybe it was within a few generations of Richard when it occurred. And that's why we have so few people. But it's a unique opportunity, as you can see, to migrate, to see how these people have moved around, which is one thing we're now looking at. And really with all the genealogy, we're just constantly seeing, no matter how we, I get to some points when we get stuck on a great-grandmother, I'll just start looking at other women that were, these are in places like, Perquimans, Perquimans County, for instance, North Carolina, is where a lot of this stuff was happening. So, and there was just a half a dozen families there. So you can, in genealogy, you just start looking at all the possibilities, and no matter which one you take back, it's all going right into the Plantagenet family. And in through the Jamestown settlement area. So that's why we're getting this feeling that, you know, these people were really coming over, and there were problems in England, right? Not just, there was civil war in the mid-1600s. People were starving almost. So they were looking for another place. A lot of Plantagenets invested in the Virginia Company, and which probably means a lot of them were coming over along with that project. And you know, unlike the Pilgrims came here for religious persecution reasons, for freedom. They wanted religious freedom, but at Jamestown, it's a business for profit kind of thing, and it ended up being tobacco. And a lot of the other settlements later on that developed used this area as a model for success. So my tree now has over 13,000 people, mostly all on my mother's side, which is what I've been focused on. And this gives you an idea of what you're talking about when you go back in time. This is just 7 generations. These are the number of great grandparents you have going back 7 generations. If you go back 25, which we may have to do, that's going to be 33 million. If you go back 37, which is the middle of the Plantagenet family, you got more people, or your great grandparents, than there are in the world. So how do you explain that? Well, you get a lot of, as you go back, people start becoming related. So you end up having a lot of duplication of grandparents throughout here. It's a hard thing to kind of get your head around, but the basic thing I'm trying to point out is how much you're going to see when you start going back in time. And of course, autosomal DNA is not going to take you a whole lot further than this, because that DNA splits in half. You get half from your mother, half from your father. So eventually the little segments, the links, come together, get to a point where they're there, but they're so small you can't say for sure that means you're related to the person. So here's a line that I built. This is not maternal, but this is one that I took back and ran into Richard III. This is Ancestry.com. So the cool thing about that is you enter all this information, then you go to the person and it'll tell you, oh, this is your second cousin 22 times removed. And if you open that up, click on that, it will show you up here. Here's Richard. So pretty much everybody on this side going forward into the future here is from England. On this side, this is Jamestown. Alice Gainey came from England to Jamestown. Now, I've seen her pop up in several trees. This particular line came from my grandfather, not my grandmother. And but I've had other lines that end up going to her, and I mean, she may have offspring in like the millions, actually, of different lines. So if people here were to do your genealogy, you might end up running into her, you know, and going to Richard III yourself. But you can see these are all. Alice came here in 1622, which is right after the Jamestown massacre, which Indians came in and killed it. I think at least 1,000 of the settlers. Jamestown had a big head start on the Pilgrims. They had, by the time the Mayflower landed, there were probably 3,000 people in Jamestown. So you would expect them to have a good portion of our country's DNA based on that head start. So we also get out in the field. Here's that cousin I mentioned to you, the 5th cousin that I found. He was pretty lucky because he retired recently and was really into genealogy. So he took the test. Those are actually graves of our, I believe it's the 4th and 5th great grandmothers of J1C2C3. And this is in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. She has lots of descendants, which is why this graveyard is apparently maintained pretty well, because they are taking care of it. There's the library. So a lot of the genealogy we need for that area is in Elizabeth City in this genealogy center. We've been there a number of times already. And of course, Ancestry.com, you can find a lot of stuff. There's a lot of mistakes. The problem we run into, like for instance, right now there's there's a Philip Perry. There were like a half a dozen of them in this little area, and people have their genealogy all mixed up. You can see it, so it can really throw you, and it takes really a long time to figure that stuff out. You just gotta try to find everything you can. In that library, we found this house. So this is our J1C2C3 grandparents. Their house was built in 1750, and we went out in the country, got permission, and found it. It was turned into a tin covered roof. Who knows how long ago, but the tin has protected it. This is the original wood. These are all hand-cut square nails that are holding this together.
So what explains this structure surviving?
I don't know. It's got the tin roof that helped, but I would have thought, well, it seems like lightning would have struck this thing and burned it up by then. Yeah, I don't know. They store stuff inside of it, and there's a bunch of junk outside of it, so it has had some care. But I don't think the owners appreciate it. They're not relatives of these people, but I'd like to buy it. It's a farm. So in 2014, Odessa and her sisters went to Leicester. Her sisters live in London, and they took a trip. And so where they dug up Richard, it was probably one of the few parking lots left in Leicester, and now it's a museum. and they've here's the hole where Richard was found. They've actually covered that with plexiglass, which is pretty neat. And we have some pictures here that you'd like to see. Odessa took a lot of other pictures.
Yes.
It's really a nice museum. It's free of charge. You don't have to pay anything to go in it. So if you're ever in Leicester, you might want to check that out. And I'll take one more jab at Henry Tudor. So here's something else that guy did. After Richard was killed, they took this famous painting of him, and they had an artist modify it. They had, I think this is the original here, but they had him modify it. They made the nose pointed. They did things with the eyebrows. They made one of his fingers unusually long. They did things to make him look evil. So the next step, we want to do press releases in critical areas. The Virginian Pilot did a story on us a couple of years back. We want to go in there and actually list the names where we are in genealogy and try to encourage people that if this name looks familiar, maybe you might want to do a DNA test, get people excited about doing stuff like that. And of course in England too, we really want to get the attention of that historian, Ashdown Hill. We think he might have done other lines, genealogy lines down. Maybe one of them he got to, he said, oh gosh, this guy went to America, let's stop here, that could be very useful to us. And of course the autosomal matching. So all of the members that we have matches with, a lot of us, that one, I know he's my fifth cousin, but a lot of the other ones we don't know. And we're comparing autosomal DNA matches, trying to figure out, we think they're a little further back. Maybe they're 6th, 7th, 8th cousins. Maybe the relation actually goes back into England. We're trying to figure that out. But we're at that point with autosomal stuff where you get down to the lengths of the matches are like, well, if you go much smaller than that, it could be a relation, may not be. 23andMe, I think their minimum segment match is like a 7. But if they see you have a match that's 10, which is significant, they'll start looking back at your smaller matches and they'll say, oh, well, the 5, we're going to report this. Chances are, if you have a big match like this, these other ones are also matches. So there's little tricky things like that they do. Of course, continue doing the genealogy backwards and working down more. As we get to each grandmother, ideally, we'd like to go to another daughter of that grandmother and work a line down to someone and have them do a DNA test. And if it's a J1C2C3, that proves we've got the genealogy correct. Does anyone have any specific questions about King Richard?
I have a question. So he had no children that survived him? Just
No, he
the
didn't.
one son who died?
Yeah, just the one son, yeah. And that was, he had so Edward, his brother, had 2 that were both disappeared. Now, the interesting thing, another thing that Tudor did was he married the daughter of Edward IV, Elizabeth of York. That was something else he did to end, the War of the Roses. That was probably a good move on his part. He united the two houses by taking her on as a wife. So actually, today's queen, the royal family, they are related to the same family through Edward IV. Shoot.
When you got your results back, one of the things, DNA testing, especially from European roots, they found that most people have a percentage of Neanderthal in them.
Yeah, I'm going to show you that.
Huh?
Yeah, I'm going to show that.
Okay.
Things on that, yeah. Yeah, and even the Denisenians, do you know how to pronounce that shoe? The Denisenians, this new.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. It's
New species, and actually Carolyn sent me something I had not seen before about a 40,000-year-old bracelet that was made by these people. And this is the one, I know you saw it in the news. They found these people. They had to get a lot of tiny women to go into this cave to excavate these bones. And these people went to great extent to bury their dead 40,000 years ago. And they have this bracelet. Nina saw, I showed Nina the picture, and it's incredible. The workmanship on it is incredible. It said it was way ahead of anything that Homo sapiens were doing. And the Neanderthals, the same thing. They're credited with the first industrial process 200,000 years ago. And there are 4 types. They say there's a 4th type too. They haven't found the bones, but DNA shows there's a 4th because these were all mixing together. And that'll soon come up in the future. But our DNA, there's also the Denisenians, whatever, they've done their DNA, and you have that in you also.
They're from Siberia.
Yeah.
But most people, European ancestors and Asian, and Australian are all 0.02, 0.04 have Neanderthal in the background.
Yep. And
Africans and Latin.
yeah, Africans are 0. Like a good example would be President Obama. His father's pure African, his mother pure European. So Europeans on the average were, I'm like the average 2.6% Neanderthal. So President Obama would be probably 1.3. Then he married Michelle, who a lot of people don't realize that African Americans are actually on the average 25% European. So when he married Michelle, so his children are probably like 1%. I figured it out. They're probably about 1% Neanderthal.
So what was Henry's claim? Henry Tudor?
He had it through the Lancaster family. He had I don't know the exact details, but he did have a legitimate claim. This is the War of the Roses. They kept going back and forth, and he was really the next best one from that house. So he, I don't think anybody challenged that part of it. It's he won, fair and square. Now there was betrayal in the battle. William Stanley, who was a large group of people that were supposed to be on Richard III's side, switched when Richard made his move to directly attack Tudor.
Right.
Stanley switched and came up behind him, and that ended it. But I guess that was all fair, and that kind of stuff. That was fair.
What's the eligibility to join the society?
There is none. I was surprised at that. You pay the money. It's $60 a year, and you're in it. There is an American branch with chapters. Nina?
So is it still true, based on that book, The 7 Daughters of Eve, that we all come from 7 women out of Africa through the mitochondrial DNA?
Yeah, I think that probably still stands. Yeah. Jay was one of those.
3 or 4 million years.
Yep. Yeah.
So you can get DNA for those to find out which woman you're associated with.
Yeah, you can. The J, like me, Jay, I'm from what was J for? Jasmine? John?
Now, totally in jest, there's a slide that you should have put in there that you didn't.
What's that?
It's a likeness of David Brinkman at Warwick Castle in England.
Oh, I forgot about that.
I just saw it, and it proves the DNA similarities. It's totally sarcastic.
It is that that gave me the creeps when I saw it.
What we'll do is I'll put that somehow out.
Okay, yeah, please do.
You can see it.
That is-
David Brinkman, I swear it is.
And it was a wax figure, right?
It's a wax figure, it was just like David.
And I thought it was a real person. I said, I need to tell me who this guy is. It's a wax figure.
Next time you hear him talking, you can put that in there.
Yeah. Maybe they found my website and modeled that thing. See?
David, being from West Virginia, I feel free to say that genealogy is easy. Our family tree only has 1 or 2 branches. On a serious note, are there any characteristics like facial features that this J1C2C3 group?
No, it's not the maternal. In fact, my back was out all this week, and if you look at an X-ray of my back, it's not that much different than Richard's actually. But and I brought that up at one point, and we have, of course, Dr. Logan, and we also have a medical doctor at UCLA, which they both immediately came back and they said, absolutely forget it. It has nothing to do with mitochondrial DNA. It's the autosomal DNA where I think like the scoliosis comes from. So, and your body features like your hair, that's all autosomal DNA. Yeah, really, there's very little, but there are diseases, disorders that these mutations come up in this mitochondrial that can hit you.
I don't know if you're aware of it, but I use Agape Primary Care on Main Street, and for about a month, they have a lady in there selling DNA tests to see if the drugs you're taking would cause problems. They said it was covered by Medicare and would be free, and so I signed up, and they did draw the blood and take care of everything for that, or whatever they did. And the results came back, and they said none of the meds I'm taking have any adverse effects. You know, I'm safe. But then they sent a $1,500 bill, which I did not pay, and Agape has terminated their contract with them for DNA. But anyway, if you're really interested, perhaps your medical doctor could has a DNA connection that it's $100 or something. They could check your meds.
You know, Dale, 23andMe used to have a medical that had things you were susceptible to, like diabetes and all those things, and also drugs. And the FDA shut them down about 3 or 4 years ago. Now they've opened it back up through all these legal dealings, but it's very limited now what they have. But what you can do, you can download your data and upload it to a couple other things, free services, and it'll tell you the same thing.
Oh, really?
So it's things that are outside of the U.S., right? Where our government has no control over. But some of them, like me, diabetes too is the biggest risk for me. And not a single person on either side of our family have had that. But we've had a lot of cases of hypoglycemia, which is the opposite, where your body produces too much insulin. So it almost sounds like they're not looking at enough. They're looking at one thing, and it may really be a combination of things they need to look at.
One more thing, I had a break-in at my house, and the Richland County sent a whole group of forensic investigators to do it, and they said they got the DNA of the perpetrator off of a fingerprint, which I did not know was possible, but they did. Is that true?
Yeah, and actually that's a point I was going to make. You know, a lot of people are paranoid for privacy reasons about doing DNA tests. They think the government's going to take it and do something with it, or insurance companies. Now, California has passed laws to protect people against that, but really, you leave a trail of DNA everywhere you go. You know, your garbage cans have a lot of it in it, so anybody can get your DNA if they wanted it. So I don't think, I get frustrated by these services, people that do their DNA, but they leave their privacy settings on maximum, and you can't find out anything. It's just really useless.
Can you explain the difference between the mitochondrial DNA and the autosomal?
So the autosomal that's really what makes you what you are, what we see in all people, and you get half of it from your mother, half from your father. It's pretty random. So every generation you lose half, like right off the bat from my mother, I only got half of mine from her. Now my aunt, and I'll show you her, she passed away in December. We got her to do 2 tests before she died. She was the last person from that generation. And we've had so many autosomal matches, and things that have helped us just because we got that extra generation. So that's another thing I would recommend. You need to, I would right now, your oldest generation, get DNA tests done on them while you can. You know, if you're the oldest generation, then do it yourself.